The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Silver Creek, Arizona Territory, in the summer of 1882. Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow as he guided his horse through the bustling frontier town. At 28, he had spent most of his adult life working cattle ranches across the Southwest, but something about this particular job felt different. The telegram in his shirt pocket had been brief and mysterious, offering double the usual pay for a simple escort job to the nearby Apache reservation. Jake had always prided himself on being a practical man. He didn't believe in superstitions or wild tales that often circulated around campfires. Native Americans were people just like anyone else, he figured, though he'd had limited direct contact with the various tribes in the region. His experience had mostly been limited to brief encounters at trading posts and the occasional glimpse of Apache riders in the distance while working remote cattle drives. The job had come through Tom Bradley, a weathered Indian agent who ran the government office in Silver Creek. Bradley was known throughout the territory as a fair man who tried to bridge the gap between the settlers and the Apache people, though tensions remained high following years of conflict. When Bradley had approached Jake about escorting a young Apache woman to visit relatives on a distant reservation, Jake had been curious about the unusually generous payment offered. "She's been living with a missionary family in Tucson for the past 3 years, Bradley had explained, his voice carrying a note of caution. "Learned English, can read and write better than most folks in town. But she's got family on the San Carlos reservation she ain't seen since she was barely more than a child. Her guardian thinks it's time she reconnected with her people." Jake had nodded, thinking the job sounded straightforward enough. Escort one person across familiar territory, collect his payment, and move on to the next opportunity. He'd made the journey to San Carlos several times before on various business, so he knew the route well. The only unusual aspect was the insistence that the trip be made quickly and quietly, without drawing attention from other travelers or local authorities. Now, as he approached the small adobe house where he was supposed to meet his traveling companion, Jake felt a strange mixture of anticipation and uncertainty. The house sat on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a well-tended garden that seemed oddly out of place in the harsh desert landscape. Colorful flowers bloomed in carefully arranged rows, and vegetables grew in neat patches that spoke of someone with both skill and patience. An elderly Mexican woman answered his knock, her dark eyes studying him carefully before she spoke. "You must be Morrison," she said in accented English. "Maria is ready, but I must warn you, she is not what most people expect when they hear Apache girl. She has lived between two worlds for many years now." Before Jake could ask what she meant, footsteps approached from inside the house. The young woman who appeared in the doorway made Jake forget whatever questions he might have had. She stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall, with the distinctive features of her Apache heritage clearly visible in her high cheekbones and dark, intelligent eyes. But everything else about her appearance spoke of her years living among the missionary family. She wore a simple but well-made traveling dress in deep blue cotton, with her long black hair braided and pinned up in a style more common among educated women in larger cities. A small leather satchel hung across her shoulder, and she carried herself with a quiet confidence that immediately commanded respect. Most striking of all were her eyes. They held a depth of knowledge and experience that seemed far beyond her apparent age of perhaps 19 or 20 years. "Mr. Morrison," she said, extending her hand in greeting. Her English was flawless, with only the slightest trace of an accent that Jake couldn't quite identify. "I am Maria Delgado, though my Apache name is Ayana. I appreciate you agreeing to escort me on this journey. I understand the route can be challenging." Jake found himself staring for a moment before remembering his manners. He shook her offered hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip. "Ma'am," he managed, touching the brim of his hat. "I've got 2 horses ready, and we can make good time if we leave within the hour. Should reach the reservation by late tomorrow if we push hard." Maria nodded, then turned to embrace the elderly woman who had answered the door. They spoke quietly in Spanish for several minutes, and Jake caught enough words to understand they were discussing the journey ahead and promises to write letters. The affection between them was obvious, and Jake realized this departure meant much more than a simple visit to relatives. As they prepared to leave, Jake noticed several interesting details about his traveling companion. She moved with an easy grace that suggested familiarity with riding and outdoor life, despite her refined appearance. Her satchel appeared to contain more than simple traveling supplies. He glimpsed the edge of what looked like carefully wrapped bundles and small containers that might hold medicines or other specialized items. Most intriguing was the way she interacted with the horses. While Jake was adjusting the saddles and checking the gear, Maria approached both animals calmly, speaking to them in soft Apache words while gently stroking their necks. The horses, normally skittish with strangers, immediately calmed under her touch. She examined the tack with an experienced eye, making small adjustments that Jake had to admit improved the fit. "You know horses," he observed, genuinely impressed by her skill. Maria smiled for the first time since their introduction, and Jake felt something shift in his chest. "My grandfather was known throughout our band for training the finest horses in the territory," she said simply. "He began teaching me before I could properly walk. Some knowledge stays with you no matter how long you're away from it." As they finally mounted and began riding out of Silver Creek, Jake found himself stealing glances at his companion. Everything about this situation challenged his assumptions about what this job would entail. Maria sat her horse with natural skill, keeping pace easily as they moved from the dusty streets onto the open trail leading north toward the reservation lands. The first few hours passed in relative silence as they established their rhythm and Jake focused on reading the terrain ahead. The route to San Carlos would take them through several different types of country: open desert plains, rocky canyons, and forested mountain passes that could hide either natural dangers or human threats. While official hostilities between the Apache bands and the U.S. Army had largely ended, tensions remained high, and travelers could still encounter problems from various sources. Jake had been hired not just as a guide but as protection, though looking at Maria's composed demeanor, he began to wonder if she might be more capable of taking care of herself than her guardian had suggested. There was something about the way she constantly scanned their surroundings, noting details and potential threats, that spoke of training far beyond what most young women received, regardless of their background. As the afternoon heat intensified, they stopped to rest the horses near a small creek that provided both water and shade from a cluster of cottonwood trees. While the animals drank, Jake took the opportunity to learn more about his mysterious traveling companion. "You mentioned you haven't seen your family in 3 years," he said, settling against a tree trunk with his hat pulled low against the sun. "That's a long time to be away from home." Maria was quiet for so long that Jake thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of sadness that she couldn't entirely hide. "Home is a complicated word for someone like me," she said. "The missionary family in Tucson gave me opportunities one would never have had otherwise: education, exposure to different ways of thinking, skills that will serve me well in a changing world. But they could never replace the connection to my people, my true heritage." She paused, watching the water flow over the rocks in the creek bed. "My father sent me to live with them when I was 16 because he believed I could learn things that would help our people survive in a world that was changing whether we wanted it to or not. He was probably right, but the cost has been 3 years of feeling like I belonged fully in neither world." Jake studied her profile as she spoke, struck by the maturity in her words and the obvious pain behind them. He had expected to be escorting a simple young woman visiting relatives, but it was becoming clear that Maria's story was far more complex than anyone had bothered to explain to him. "What kind of work did you do with the missionaries?" he asked, genuinely curious. "Teaching, mostly," Maria replied, turning to look at him directly. "The children of Mexican and Anglo families who were struggling to read and write. But I also learned about medicine, both the kind they practice in their hospitals and clinics, and traditional Apache healing methods that I studied with an elderly woman who lived near Tucson." She reached into her satchel and carefully withdrew a small leather pouch. "Many of the plants and herbs that grow in this region have powerful healing properties that most settlers don't recognize. The combination of both types of knowledge has proven very useful." Jake felt a growing respect for this young woman who had managed to bridge two very different worlds while maintaining her connection to both. But he also sensed that there were layers to her story that she hadn't yet shared. The generous payment for this escort job, the insistence on discretion, and Maria's obvious intelligence all suggested that this journey involved more than a simple family reunion. As they prepared to resume their travel, Jake made a decision to trust his instincts. Something important was happening here, and he wanted to understand what role he was playing in events that clearly extended far beyond his initial understanding of the job. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant lower across the desert landscape as they mounted their horses and continued north toward the reservation lands where Maria's family waited. Whatever secrets this journey might reveal, Jake was beginning to realize that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The second day of their journey began before dawn, with Maria already awake and tending to the horses when Jake emerged from his bedroll. He had slept fitfully, partly due to the hard ground and partly because of strange dreams filled with images he couldn't quite remember upon waking. Maria moved quietly around their small camp, her movements efficient and purposeful in the pre-dawn darkness. "Coffee?" she asked softly, indicating a small pot she had positioned over the carefully banked coals of their fire. The aroma that reached Jake's nose was rich and complex, unlike the bitter brew he usually made on the trail. "You're full of surprises," Jake said, accepting the tin cup she offered. The coffee was indeed exceptional, with a flavor that seemed to blend familiar tastes with something more exotic that he couldn't identify. Maria smiled mysteriously. "My grandmother taught me many useful skills before I left for Tucson." She said a person never knows when small knowledge might prove valuable. She paused, her expression growing more serious. "She also told me that this journey would be more important than it appeared, though I didn't understand what she meant at the time." As they prepared to break camp, Jake noticed that Maria had arranged their supplies in a different pattern than he typically used. When he asked about it, she explained that her method would distribute the weight more evenly and reduce strain on the horses over long distances. Her modifications also made certain items more accessible without requiring them to unpack everything, a detail that suggested experience with situations where quick access to supplies might be necessary. The trail they followed wound through increasingly rugged country as they climbed toward the higher elevations that surrounded the San Carlos reservation. Jake had traveled this route several times before, but Maria's presence changed his perspective on the landscape around them. She pointed out plants and geographical features that he had previously overlooked, explaining their significance in Apache culture and practical uses that settlers rarely understood. "That grove of oak trees," she said, indicating a cluster of trees in a protected valley below them, "produces acorns that my people have harvested for generations. Properly prepared, they provide nutrition that can sustain a family through the harshest winters. And those rock formations we passed an hour ago, they contain a spring that flows year-round, even during the worst droughts." Jake listened with growing fascination as Maria shared knowledge that transformed the seemingly empty wilderness into a landscape rich with resources and meaning. Her education with the missionaries had clearly enhanced rather than replaced her traditional Apache understanding of the natural world. As the morning progressed, they encountered other travelers on the trail, a merchant wagon heading south toward Tucson, a small group of cavalry soldiers on routine patrol, and a family of settlers in a covered wagon moving slowly north with all their worldly possessions. Each encounter provided Jake with new insights into Maria's character and abilities. With the merchant, she conducted a brief conversation in fluent Spanish, learning news about conditions ahead and trading a small amount of coffee for information about water sources. The cavalry soldiers treated her with wary respect once they learned she was traveling to visit family on the reservation, though Jake noticed their sergeant's eyes linger on her with obvious curiosity about her unusual combination of Apache features and refined appearance. Most interesting was her interaction with the settler family, who had stopped to rest their oxen near a waterhole. The woman was clearly pregnant and exhausted from the journey, while their two small children showed signs of illness that their father was trying to ignore. Maria approached them with quiet confidence, introducing herself simply as someone with knowledge of desert travel and local conditions. Within minutes, she had diagnosed that the children were suffering from mild dehydration and exposure to unfamiliar plants that had caused stomach upset. From her satchel, she produced dried herbs that she brewed into a tea, explaining to the mother exactly how much to give each child and how often. She also provided practical advice about protecting the family from sun exposure and recommended modifications to their travel schedule that would help them reach their destinations safely. The settler woman accepted Maria's help gratefully, though her husband remained suspicious until he saw how quickly the children began to improve after drinking the herbal tea. As they prepared to part ways, the man pressed a silver dollar into Maria's hand despite her protests, insisting that her knowledge was worth far more than his meager payment could represent. "How did you learn so much about medicine?" Jake asked as they resumed their journey. Necessity, Maria replied simply. When you live between two worlds, you learn to be useful in both. The missionaries taught me about their medical practices and the scientific principles behind different treatments. But my grandmother and her sister taught me about the healing plants that grow in this region and how to prepare them properly. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes scanning the horizon ahead. During my time in Tucson, I often treated people that the regular doctors either couldn't help or wouldn't see because they were Mexican or Apache. Word spread quietly through certain communities that I could provide effective treatment for many common problems. Jake felt a growing admiration for this remarkable young woman who seemed to possess skills and knowledge far beyond her apparent age. But he also sensed that there were still aspects of her story that she hadn't shared. The generous payment for this escort job and the emphasis on discretion suggested that Maria's return to the reservation involved more than simple family visiting. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the character of the landscape began to change dramatically. Pine forests replaced the desert scrub of the lower elevations, and the air became noticeably cooler and cleaner. Maria's demeanor also seemed to shift as they entered this region. She sat straighter in her saddle, and her eyes took on an alert quality that suggested they were approaching territory that held special significance for her. We're getting close to traditional Apache lands now, she explained, noting Jake's observation of her changed behavior. This country has been home to my people for countless generations. Every canyon, every mountain peak, every stream has stories and significance that connect to our history and spiritual beliefs. Late in the afternoon, they reached a high ridge that offered sweeping views of the valley where the San Carlos Reservation was located. Jake had seen this vista before, but Maria's presence made him notice details that had previously escaped his attention. She pointed out specific landmarks: a distinctive rock formation, a particular bend in the river, a grove of trees that seemed to glow in the slanted sunlight. "That's where my grandfather is buried," she said quietly, indicating a hillside dotted with ancient juniper trees. "And that meadow near the river is where my grandmother taught me to identify the plants that could heal or harm. I've dreamed about this view many times during my years in Tucson." As they began their descent toward the reservation, Jake noticed smoke rising from cooking fires and the movement of people going about their daily activities. But he also observed that Maria was growing increasingly tense, her hands gripping the reins more tightly and her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. "Is everything all right?" he asked, concerned by the change in her demeanor. Maria was quiet for a long moment before answering. "There are things about this homecoming that you don't understand yet," she said finally. "My family asked me to return because they believe I have learned skills that could help our people during a very difficult time. But accepting that responsibility will mean giving up the possibility of returning to the life I built in Tucson." She turned to look at Jake directly, and he was struck by the intensity in her dark eyes. "The secret I carry isn't just about medical knowledge or education. It's about a choice that will determine not just my future, but potentially the future of many families on this reservation." Jake felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. The simple escort job he had agreed to was clearly part of something much larger and more significant than anyone had bothered to explain to him. But looking at Maria's determined expression, he realized that whatever challenges lay ahead, he was committed to seeing this journey through to its conclusion. As the sun began to set behind the western peaks, casting long shadows across the valley floor, they approached the outskirts of the reservation where Maria's family waited. The quiet sounds of evening activities, children playing, women preparing dinner, men caring for horses and livestock, created a peaceful atmosphere that seemed at odds with the tension Jake sensed in his traveling companion. "Whatever happens next," Maria said softly, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for your companionship on this journey. You've shown respect and kindness that not all men in your position would have offered to someone like me." Jake nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure what she meant by "someone like me." But as they rode into the settlement where Maria's family lived, he had the distinct feeling that he was about to discover secrets that would change his understanding of everything he thought he knew about the young Apache woman riding beside him. The Apache settlement appeared gradually as they descended into the valley, with traditional wickiups and more recent adobe structures scattered among groves of cottonwood trees near the river. Smoke from evening cooking fires created a hazy atmosphere that carried the mixed aromas of roasting meat, cornbread, and unfamiliar spices. As they rode closer, Jake noticed people emerging from their homes to watch their arrival, their faces showing curiosity mixed with wariness at the sight of a white cowboy accompanying the young Apache woman. An elderly man approached as they dismounted near the largest dwelling in the settlement. His withered face broke into a broad smile when he saw Maria, and he spoke rapidly in Apache while embracing her warmly. Jake stood aside respectfully, holding both horses while the reunion continued. Several other family members gathered around, and Jake could hear the emotional undertones in their conversation even though he couldn't understand the words. Maria finally turned to introduce him to her family, switching smoothly to English. "This is Jake Morrison, the man who escorted me safely from Silver Creek. Jake, I'd like you to meet my grandfather, Joseph Crowfeather, and my grandmother, Elena." Jake removed his hat and nodded respectfully to the elderly couple. Joseph Crowfeather studied him with intelligent eyes that seemed to measure his character in a single glance. When he spoke, his English was clear though heavily accented. "Any man who brings our granddaughter home safely is welcome at our fire," he said formally. "You will eat with us tonight and rest before continuing your journey." As the family led them toward the central dwelling, Jake noticed several details that surprised him. The settlement was clearly more prosperous and organized than he had expected, with well-maintained buildings, carefully tended gardens, and livestock that appeared healthy and well cared for. The people they encountered seemed confident and purposeful rather than defeated or demoralized, despite the hardships that reservation life typically imposed. Inside the main dwelling, Jake found himself in a large room that blended traditional Apache design with practical modern additions. Woven rugs covered parts of the packed earth floor, while handmade furniture provided comfortable seating around a central fire pit. Oil lamps supplemented the firelight, and Jake glimpsed books and writing materials on a small table near one wall. As the family prepared the evening meal, Jake observed the easy way Maria slipped back into the rhythms of Apache domestic life. She helped her grandmother with food preparation while simultaneously catching up on family news and community events. Her fluent switching between English and Apache, combined with her obvious familiarity with traditional tasks, reinforced Jake's impression that she had successfully maintained connections to both worlds during her years away. The dinner conversation revealed information that began to explain the mysterious aspects of this journey. Joseph Crowfeather spoke carefully about problems the reservation community was facing: a series of illnesses that the government doctor couldn't effectively treat, disputes with Indian agency officials over resource allocation, and growing tensions with neighboring Anglo settlers who wanted to claim reservation lands for their own use. "The agent they sent us last year is not like Tom Bradley," Joseph explained, his voice carrying obvious frustration. "This man sees our people as problems to be managed rather than human beings with legitimate needs and rights. He's reduced our food rations and medical supplies while demanding that we provide free labor for projects that benefit only the white settlements." Elena added details about specific families who were struggling with illness and malnutrition, particularly among the elderly and very young. "The government doctor comes once a month if we're fortunate, but he doesn't understand our constitution or the medicines that work best for our people. Many are suffering unnecessarily." As Jake listened to these accounts, he began to understand why Maria's return was so significant to her family and community. Her combination of traditional Apache knowledge and modern medical training could provide exactly the kind of help these people desperately needed. But he also sensed that there were still aspects of the situation that the family hadn't fully explained. After dinner, Joseph Crowfeather invited Jake to step outside for a private conversation. The two men walked slowly toward the river, their footsteps quiet on the sandy ground. The older man was silent for several minutes before beginning to speak in a low, serious tone. "There are things about my granddaughter that you should understand," he said finally. "Her time with the missionaries was not just about education and medical training. Maria has gifts that go beyond what most people possess, abilities that connect her to old knowledge and traditions that few of our young people understand anymore." Jake waited respectfully for the older man to continue, sensing that he was being trusted with information that outsiders rarely received. "Before she left for Tucson, Maria showed signs of what our people call seeing beyond the visible world," Joseph continued. "She could often predict when storms would come or sense when someone in the community was becoming ill before symptoms appeared. Her grandmother recognized these gifts and began training her in the old ways of healing and spiritual guidance. The elderly Apache paused to study Jake's face in the moonlight. The missionary family was told only that she had exceptional intelligence and aptitude for learning. They were not told about her other abilities, because such knowledge would have frightened them and possibly put Maria in danger. Jake felt a chill as the implications of this revelation began to sink in. Are you saying she has some kind of supernatural powers? Joseph Crowfeather smiled slightly at Jake's obvious discomfort. I am saying that she understands connections between the physical and spiritual worlds that your people have forgotten how to see. Combined with her modern medical knowledge, these abilities make her uniquely qualified to help our community in ways that no government doctor could match. As they walked back toward the settlement, Jake tried to process this new information about his traveling companion. Looking back over their journey, he began to notice details that had seemed insignificant at the time: Maria's uncanny ability to predict weather changes, her immediate success in calming nervous horses, her accurate diagnoses of the settler children's illness based on minimal observation. When they rejoined the family gathering, Jake found Maria in deep conversation with several community members who had come to welcome her home. He could see the respect and hope in their faces as they described various problems and challenges they were facing. Maria listened intently to each person, occasionally asking detailed questions or requesting clarification about symptoms and circumstances. Tomorrow I will begin visiting families to assess what help I can provide, Maria announced to the group. I've brought medicines and supplies from Tucson, but I also need to gather certain plants and herbs that grow in this region to prepare traditional remedies. An elderly woman spoke up from near the fire. The agent has forbidden us from leaving the reservation boundaries without written permission. He claims it's for our own protection, but everyone knows he's trying to prevent us from hunting and gathering as our people have always done. Maria's expression grew thoughtful. Then, we'll have to be creative about how we obtain what we need. There are ways to work within their restrictions while still taking care of our people. Jake sensed undercurrents in this conversation that suggested Maria's return involved plans more complex and potentially dangerous than simple medical care. The determination in her voice and the knowing looks exchanged by the family members indicated that they were discussing strategies that might not meet with official approval from the Indian agency. As the evening grew late and family members began to disperse to their own homes, Maria approached Jake with a serious expression. I need to ask you an important question, and I want you to think carefully before answering. Jake nodded, though he felt apprehensive about what she might be planning to request. Your job was to escort me safely to my family, and you fulfilled that obligation, Maria said quietly. But I'm hoping you might be willing to stay for a few more days to help with something that could make a real difference in these people's lives. She paused, studying his face in the flickering firelight. There are medicines and supplies hidden in locations outside the reservation boundaries, resources that my grandmother and other traditional healers cached in secret places before the restrictions were imposed. If I could retrieve those materials, I could treat many of the illnesses that are currently causing suffering in our community. Jake felt his heart rate increase as he began to understand what she was suggesting. You're talking about leaving the reservation without permission, which could get you in serious trouble with the Indian agency. And you want me to help you do it? Maria nodded calmly. I'm talking about saving lives using knowledge and resources that belong to my people by right. The question is whether you're willing to help someone do what's morally necessary, even if it might conflict with what's legally permitted. Jake looked into her dark eyes and saw the same determination and courage that had impressed him throughout their journey. But he also realized that his answer to her request would determine not just what happened next, but what kind of man he chose to be in a situation that demanded he choose between following rules and doing what was right. The crackling of the fire and the distant sounds of the nighttime desert provided a backdrop for one of the most important decisions Jake Morrison had ever been asked to make. Jake stared into the dying embers of the fire for a long moment, weighing the risks and implications of Maria's request. Everything he had observed during their journey had shown him that she was a person of exceptional character and ability, someone whose judgment he had come to respect deeply. But helping her retrieve hidden medical supplies would mean breaking federal regulations and potentially putting both of them in serious legal jeopardy. If we're caught outside the reservation without permission, what happens? He asked quietly. For you, probably a fine and some uncomfortable questions from the territorial authorities, Maria replied honestly. For me, it could mean imprisonment or forced removal to a more restrictive reservation. But, if I don't retrieve those supplies, people in this community will continue to suffer and possibly die from treatable conditions. Jake studied her face in the moonlight, seeing the weight of responsibility she carried and the courage it took to ask for his help despite the risks involved. After a moment, he made his decision. What do you need me to do? Maria's relief was visible, though she tried to hide it. There are 3 locations where my grandmother and the other healers hid supplies before the new restrictions were imposed. 2 are within a day's ride from here, but 1 is nearly 2 days away in the mountains where certain rare plants grow that can't be found anywhere else. She produced a small piece of bark with marks scratched into its surface. My grandmother drew this map before I left for Tucson, hoping that someday I would return with the skills to use what they had preserved. The locations are chosen to be invisible to anyone who doesn't know exactly what to look for. Over the next hour, Maria explained the plan in detail. They would leave before dawn, officially telling anyone who asked that Jake was departing for his return journey to Silver Creek. Instead, they would circle around to the first cache location, retrieve what supplies they could carry, and return by a different route that would bring them back to the settlement after nightfall. The most dangerous aspect would be avoiding the Indian Agency officials and cavalry patrols that periodically checked the reservation boundaries. Maria had studied the patrol patterns during previous visits and believed they could avoid detection if they timed their movements carefully and used traditional Apache techniques for traveling unobserved. One more thing, Maria said as they finalized their plans. When we return, you should be prepared to leave the reservation immediately. Once I begin using these traditional medicines alongside what I learned in Tucson, the results will be obvious to anyone paying attention. The Indian agent will eventually realize that someone has been providing unauthorized medical care, and he'll investigate until he discovers the source. Jake nodded grimly. And, when he does, you'll be in serious trouble whether I'm here or not. Yes, Maria admitted. But, the good I can do before that happens will be worth the consequences. These people have suffered enough, and I have knowledge that can help them. I won't stand by and watch them struggle when I can make a difference. They spent the rest of the night making careful preparations. Maria assembled a selection of modern medical supplies from her bag while also gathering traditional tools and containers for processing plant materials. Jake checked their horses and equipment, making sure everything was ready for hard travel over rough terrain. Before dawn, they slipped quietly away from the settlement, following a route that took them up into the foothills where the risk of encountering official patrols was minimal. Maria proved to be an exceptional guide, leading them through terrain that seemed impassable but actually offered hidden paths known only to people with intimate knowledge of the country. The first cache site was located in a small cave hidden behind a waterfall in a narrow canyon. Inside, Jake was amazed to discover carefully wrapped bundles containing dried plants, prepared medicines, and specialized tools for healing work. Everything had been perfectly preserved in clay pots sealed with pine pitch, showing the forethought and skill of the people who had created this hidden resource. This represents generations of accumulated knowledge, Maria explained as they carefully loaded the supplies into their saddlebags. Some of these plant preparations are made from flowers that bloom only once every few years, or roots that must be harvested at exactly the right season. Replacing what we're taking would require years of patient work. The second location proved more challenging to reach, requiring them to climb steep rocky slopes where the horses had to be led rather than ridden. But the effort was worthwhile. This cache contained rare minerals and specialized plant materials that Maria explained were essential for treating certain types of serious illness. As they made their way back toward the reservation, Jake noticed that Maria seemed to be growing more confident and purposeful with each mile. The supplies they had retrieved represented more than just medical resources. They connected her to generations of ancestral knowledge and gave her the tools she needed to fulfill her role as a healer for her community. "There's something I need to tell you," Maria said as they paused to rest the horses near a mountain stream. "When I begin treating people with these traditional medicines, the results will be dramatic enough that word will spread beyond the reservation. Some government officials will see this as a threat to their authority and control." Jake sensed there was more to this revelation than she had yet explained. "What exactly are you expecting to happen?" Maria was quiet for a moment, her eyes focused on the distant peaks. My grandmother had visions about my return to the reservation. She saw that I would help many people, but also that my actions would eventually force a confrontation with the authorities that could have consequences far beyond this community. She turned to look at Jake directly. There are people in Washington who want to eliminate traditional Apache culture entirely. They believe that forcing us to abandon our customs and spiritual practices will make us easier to control. A young Apache woman who successfully combines traditional healing knowledge with modern medical training represents exactly the kind of cultural persistence they're trying to prevent. Jake felt a chill as he began to understand the broader implications of Maria's mission. You're not just treating sick people. You're proving that Apache traditions have value and should be preserved. Exactly, Maria confirmed. And that makes me dangerous to people who profit from keeping indigenous communities dependent and demoralized. Eventually, they'll try to stop me, and that's when things could become very difficult for anyone associated with my work. As they approached the reservation boundaries, Jake realized that his involvement in this mission had evolved far beyond the simple escort job he had originally agreed to accept. But, looking at Maria's determined expression and thinking about the suffering families he had met the previous evening, he knew he had made the right choice in helping her retrieve the hidden medical supplies. That night, Maria began her work in earnest, visiting families throughout the settlement and providing treatments that combined the best of both traditional and modern medical knowledge. Jake watched in amazement as children with persistent coughs began breathing easily after receiving herbal preparations, elderly people with joint pain found relief through specialized plant-based treatments, and pregnant women received care that addressed their specific needs in ways the government doctor had never attempted. Word of Maria's remarkable healing abilities spread quickly throughout the Apache community and beyond. Within a week, people were traveling from other reservations to seek her help, and even some sympathetic Anglo settlers began quietly bringing their families for treatment. Jake remained at the reservation for 2 more weeks, officially serving as Maria's assistant but actually learning more about medicine, Apache culture, and the complex challenges facing indigenous communities than he had ever imagined possible. He watched Maria transform from the educated young woman he had escorted from Silver Creek into a confident healer and community leader whose influence extended far beyond medical care. But he also saw the growing attention from Indian agency officials who were becoming suspicious of the sudden improvement in health conditions throughout the reservation. Maria's success was making their neglect and incompetence obvious, and Jake knew it was only a matter of time before they took action to protect their positions. On his final morning at the reservation, Maria walked with him to where his horse waited, loaded for the journey back to Silver Creek. Her expression was calm but serious as she prepared to say goodbye. "Thank you for everything you've done," she said simply. "Your help made it possible for me to serve my people in ways I never could have managed alone." Jake nodded, feeling oddly reluctant to leave despite knowing that his continued presence would eventually cause problems for Maria and her community. "What will you do when the Indian agent finally figures out what's been happening here?" Maria smiled with quiet confidence. "I'll continue healing people and preserving the knowledge my ancestors entrusted to me. Whatever consequences come from that choice, I'll face them knowing that I've honored my responsibilities to my community and my heritage." As Jake rode away from the reservation, he carried with him memories of the most remarkable woman he had ever met and a new understanding of the courage required to stand up for what was right in the face of powerful opposition. The secret Maria had revealed was not just her exceptional healing abilities, but her determination to use those gifts in service of her people regardless of the personal cost. 6 months later, Jake learned through travelers' reports that Maria Delgado had been arrested by federal authorities on charges of practicing medicine without proper credentials and inciting unrest among reservation populations. But by then, her methods and knowledge had spread to healers throughout the Southwest, and the impact of her brief but intensive period of service continued to benefit Apache communities for generations to come. The Apache girl who had revealed her secret to one cowboy who couldn't believe his eyes had proven that individual courage and determination could create changes that outlasted any attempts to suppress them.